Welcome to the Pulling the Threads podcast, where we seek to unravel the deeper connections between history and mythology through textual criticism and archaeology using the lens of the historical critical method. I'm your host, Jeremiah Gill, and today we're diving into the fascinating world of the ancient Near Eastern Sumerian myths and their influence on the Torah. This is by far one of my favorite topics, and today we have with us our guest is Joshua Bowen, a leading expert. Why can't I say that? A leading expert in biblical Hebrew, Sumerian, Akkadian, Assyriology, with studies from Johns Hopkins University, and he runs Digital Hammurabi. It's great to have you here. I'd like to ask you a short summary of your background and interest in the ancient Near Eastern traditions. I find your journey out of Christianity interesting as well, myself having been in Bible college and ministry and eventually exiting Christianity, opting for conservative Judaism, but more secular strain. What got you interested in ancient Near Eastern studies? And I understand that you did the Atheist Guide to the Old Testament. So
Yep.
yeah, just give me a summary of your
Okay.
background there a little bit.
Yeah. So I grew up. First of all, thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate that was a very kind introduction. I don't know that I would consider myself leading in any way, but I have some some training in the ancient Near East and the Hebrew Bible. So um, I grew up fundamentalist evangelical Christian, and so the Bible was always very much my passion. I went to Liberty University to get my bachelor's degree in religion, focusing on, um, the basic theology and then some of the biblical languages. And I went to seminary at a very conservative fundamentalist school where I took 6 years of Koine Greek and 6 years of biblical Hebrew, and also took Aramaic and Akkadian and some Ugaritic and yeah, some other other fun stuff. I ended up teaching the Hebrew cycle there for them for 2 years as an adjunct. And I guess my grades and experience and everything got me a slot at Johns Hopkins University studying in the ancient Near Eastern studies department. And I focused in on the field of Assyriology, which is the languages and cultures of ancient Iraq and Mesopotamia. And uh, because of my 6 years of grad school already in Hebrew Bible, I minored in that. So I was taking courses in Hebrew Bible. I took comprehensive exams in Hebrew Bible. So I do not put myself forward at all as a Hebrew Bible scholar, because I think that should be reserved for people that got their PhDs in it. I only minored in it. So, but I do. For better or for worse, I end up doing an awful lot of Hebrew Bible stuff here online, which is good.
Mhm.
But yeah, I did write the Atheist Handbook to the Old Testament, volumes 1 and 2. I wrote first and second editions of Did the Old Testament Endorse Slavery? My wife Megan and I wrote Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian, volumes 1 and 2. The third one is underway. So yeah, we've got some stuff out there. Megan runs the YouTube channel Digital Hammurabi, where we go into all kinds of stuff like this. And of course, she's the um, host of the Bart Ehrman Misquoting Jesus podcast. So she's way cooler than I am.
All right. All right. So let's get into the topics today. Let's start with Abraham. The Torah, the Bible is full of, I would say legendary accounts of people and places that most likely or maybe existed. Yet these accounts have been embellished through the history, people, places where they've been. These histories, may have been mythologized. Uh, to me, the Torah seems like a reframing of some Sumerian myth in a monotheistic fashion, but seems to share some similar foundations. The story that excites me the most in the ancient Near East is the story of Abraham. Um, Really, when you kind of look at where he comes from, looking at, him coming from, uh, it says Ur of Chaldea, which would be there in those trade routes. And what always kind of struck me, because I went to the Museum of the Book, and you see a lot of the writing in Akkadian on those little clay tablets, is that The influences that the what how do I want to say this? How the Akkadian contract tradition that happened on the canopic jars, how that may have influenced the ideas with the suzerainty treaties, the Code of Hammurabi, Akkadian contracts, how did, I guess, where Abraham came from, if this is truly based on the history of a person, again, mythologized, so I'm not sure, it happened the way it says it happened, but um, how does where he came from inform the formation of the Hebrew covenant?
Yeah, sort of some big questions there. And sorry that 3-year-old twins are getting put to bed. So in case you hear them in the background, I apologize. They do not like going to bed. So okay. Um, I'll kind of start down a path and feel free to steer me whichever direction you want me to go.
Mhm.
So that everybody kind of gets the background here. Um, the we know about um the languages and cultures of the ancient Near East, which again is sort of stems from, over near the western side of Iran, the Zagros Mountains there, all the way across to the Mediterranean and, up into Anatolia and down into Egypt. And that sort of broad area, there's a lot of what we might call like, I don't want to say homogeneity, but there's a lot of influence going on throughout the millennia, and we can see this starting when writing develops at the end of the fourth millennium in southern Mesopotamia. We start to see mythological text coming through the third millennium. We start to see mythological text, literary text starting to develop, and certainly by the beginning of the second millennium BCE, you see sort of an explosion in Sumerian and Akkadian literary texts. And a lot of these have to do with the gods interacting with people, so they're classified as myths. So um, all of that to sort of set the background broadly. Again, Jeremiah, I know you know all this, but just for everybody watching who may not, the Israelites, as we know them historically, we really don't see them developing as a people, coming together as a people, in whatever fashion, proto-Israelites, whatever we want to call them, until like the 12th century, the Iron One, BCE. And so before that, they're part of the indigenous population of the Canaanites, right? They just with Egypt and the Hittites sort of fighting over control of the Levant, in that area of Canaan, and Egypt having control over it. There's a lot of interplay there. There's a lot of tradition that gets moved back and forth. But uh, all of that is sort of in the cultural background of the ancient Israelites. And we don't have a lot of data that we can say outside of, archaeological data. There's not a lot that we can really pinpoint about some of the specifics as we see them depicted in the Hebrew Bible with like, David and Solomon, like the United Monarch, or, like we don't have an awful lot that we can
Mhm.
really hang our hat on.
Mhm.
Um, but where we start to, um, I think, have some more confidence in what the biblical texts are saying from a historical standpoint is when we start getting into like the 8th century and later, right? And all of this has in its background chronologically uh, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. This is the empire that's in control over in Mesopotamia. And then, of course, in 722, we have the northern kingdom of Israel falling to the Assyrians, and then in of course they fall to the Babylonians at the end of the 8th century, or the end of the 7th century, and then uh, Judah falls, Jerusalem falls in 586. A lot of people are taken captive into captivity down in Babylon or in Babylonia. And so you have this, I say all this to say there is a tremendous amount of upheaval over 2 centuries in not only the southern Levant in Israel and the areas of Israel and Judah, but also this people group that is undergoing tremendous amounts of trauma in their own land are now being taken into captivity, where many of the people that were part of the scribal tradition are being moved into into Mesopotamia, into Babylonia, and undergoing trauma there. But now it's face to face with mythological and literary and textual traditions of the people from Mesopotamia, the Babylonians. And so out of all of this, you end up with scribes who have their own traditions that they're bringing from their homeland, right? That they've been carrying down for probably several centuries, and they are now being influenced either uh, either positively being influenced, utilizing mythological ideas, or reacting to and polemicizing what they see going on around them. And so there's a lot of that interaction in the Hebrew Bible, particularly in the Pentateuch, particularly in like the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis. And so I think being able to sort of have that in the background when we then go into things like Genesis 1 and does the Anuma Alish influence this? Or when we go into the covenant code in Exodus 21, is this influenced by the Code of Hammurabi? All of these things I think need to be in the background, this historical context in which these people that are carrying on the scribal traditions, they're operating, they're living and having suffered this trauma, what that does to their tradition. So I don't know if that was a good place to start. Of course, we can go whatever direction you want from there, but um,
That's a good place to start. I mean, we're looking at culture and context as a catalyst for the message to, where did the message come from? How did it develop, and what did it become? A lot of sacred traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, they look at it as like a holy book that thus said God, and it was, God spoke on, gave the Ten Commandments on the mountain, and um, I think it was more of a human thing that happened, and it's a tradition that, the Torah itself, I would say, is a cultural thing. It is the cultural tradition of the Jewish people, of the Israeli, the Hebrew people, but it's informed by the cultures that surround it, and it didn't just pop up on its own.
yeah,
And so that's what I want to trace here is kind of how was it, how did it come to be? And what links can we look to?
yeah,
Um, I want to kind of go, yeah, kind of sequentially through this. Creation myths, the Torah thing, the Ten Commandments. Like where do these kind of ideas come
yeah.
from? Starting with the kind of first area, um, the idea of shared creation myths and the flood.
Okay.
Moving on to the broader ancient Near Eastern myths, we see significant parallels in Sumerian and biblical narratives. I'd like to look at the Sumerian creation, flood, and like Tower of Babel myths. Can you share insights from like whether the Enuma Elish, Atrahasis, or the Epic of Gilgamesh, what elements they contain that echoes the big parts of the Genesis story? Because in Genesis we have God creating out of the primordial waters a garden. You've got a conflict, the tree of life, and then you have eventually you have the rebellion with the giants.
Mm,
and then the flood and the Tower of Babel. And I feel like all of these big key elements of that story all have pre-existing story elements that um, and maybe before you answer that, I want to ask you a question. When we talk about textual tradition of the nearness to a text to its origin story, um, the oldest copies that I know that we have of the Old Testament come from the Dead Sea Scrolls, second,
mhm,
third century before the Common Era, maybe even to the first century. Somewhere in there's, those are
mhm,
the oldest physical copies we have,
mhm,
which would put it not so close to the origin of the story when it's alleged to happen.
right.
Now we have in the Sumerian myth, we have tablets, clay tablets. So we can have potentially older and closer to the source. So before answering my question about the big key elements of the story narrative, how old are the most ancient texts that we have? Tablets of the Sumerian myths, because you have Sumerian, the Akkadian,
Mhm.
and it kind of goes one from the other. What are the oldest ones we have, and how close are they to the origin of the story it tells potentially?
Yeah. So, writing develops, the last few centuries of the fourth millennium. So, 3,300 to 3,000 BCE. And these are mostly administrative or economic texts. Um, as you start moving through the first half of the third millennium, you start to see writing diversify a little bit. And certainly by the time you get to the end of the third millennium, you have literary texts that have developed mythologies. So there are some very well-known literary texts like the Curse of Agade, and these again they're extant, right? We have copies of them. Um, so one of the interesting things I think most people like when they think about the flood story, for example, flood story is very well known, as you said, from ancient Mesopotamia, and I think what people want to do, and reasonably so, is tie it to an actual event, right? And so you think about things like, oh, 13,000 BCE or something, they got this, event or the Mediterranean like fills or something, not my area of specialization.
Mm,
Um, the problem with the flood tradition, though, is that it sort of does spring up. Um, and relatively quickly in the beginning of the second millennium, which is odd if it is remembering this like ancient event and passing it down. And and
mm,
and here's one of the reasons that it's strange. Because we have texts throughout the third millennium, uh, and specific texts that later incorporate the flood story into them, but we have them from the third millennium and they don't have the flood story incorporated into them. And then in the beginning of the second millennium, when a bunch of sort of flood stories come out in Mesopotamia, uh, now that, so the story that I'm talking about or the text that I'm talking about is the Sumerian king list.
okay.
So anybody can go onto the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature, ETCSL, and find an English translation of the Sumerian king list. But you can see that there's this introductory section that has cities that kingship descends upon, and these people rule for 36,000 years, and then somebody else rules for 28,000 years, and so on. But then after the initial section, it says, and then the flood swept over.
Mm,
And it's referring to this flood tradition, right? This flood story. Well, we have copies extant of the
mm,
Sumerian king list from the third millennium, from the last bit of the third millennium. And they don't have this flood story, this portion of the flood, this initial section with that flood note at the end incorporated into the story yet. When you get down into the second millennium, it is incorporated. And this is when the story of like Atrahasis develops. It's when the earliest copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh start to appear. And so there was a book that was written about this, the flood catastrophe, I think is what it's called, but it's Chen, I think is the author that wrote it in 2012, 2013. But he's looking at the origin, like when did the flood story develop? And that's sort of the argument that it's actually in the beginning of the second millennium. Why is that important? Well, we don't know of any events, like major events that, we would say, oh, like the Mediterranean filling up or something that would, spark this thing that they would be passing down. It doesn't seem like there's this tradition being handed down in that way because it doesn't make it into text that we might expect it to make it into. But at all of that to say, it certainly goes back to the early second millennium BCE, and it shows up in the Sumerian flood story. It shows up in the story of Atrahasis. It shows up again early sections of the portions of the Gilgamesh epic, and so you have this story about the gods set of gods sending a flood and a flood survivor brings on some animals, right? And the name changes. You have Ziusudra, you have Utanapishtim, but you have Atrahasis, but there's consistency sort of in the broad layout of the story, even in many of the specifics. And so because of that, by the time you get down into the late second millennium, the Gilgamesh epic has developed, pretty extensively, and now we have, full copy by this point of Atrahasis. Like we can see that the story, and so there's a lot of data there, both in Akkadian and Sumerian, that we can do comparative analysis between that and what we see in the Hebrew Bible. And one of the things that scholars have noted since, Akkadian has been translated and these Sumerian texts have been, gone through over the past century plus, is that you have certain, not only broad themes, not only the main storyline matching in Genesis 6 through 9, but some specific terms that are used that stand out in the Hebrew, that they're not common at all if they're used elsewhere at all. But they're very common in these flood stories and these creation stories in Akkadian. And so scholars have long noted these parallels. And what that has done is it has as we're doing here, posing the question, where is the contact? Where is the intertextuality taking place? How is it that we have, like the term for pitch, when we have a good Hebrew word for pitch, why is it that they're using this other Semitic word for pitch that is the word that shows up in the Akkadian stories, right? Why is that? And so, that's where the sort of the investigation comes from. It's why we're looking. And so, and feel free, Jeremiah, to stop me at any time.
Yeah, you're
but
doing
I
fine
think
right now.
I think a good place to sort of get a high but not too high view of this is looking at the span of the primeval history, looking at Genesis 1 through 11. You were talking about the major components of it, right?
Yeah.
And, oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I kind of want to bring us back a little bit.
Okay.
I like where you're going. Now, you had kind of went off, and I was like a later question I was going to ask about, the pre-Diluvian flood myths if it came in. My real question for this is the bones of, and I feel like you're kind of getting there, but the bones of the Genesis story, what pieces are directly connected, and
Mhm.
and I feel like you're getting there. I just want to,
Yeah. So I think most scholars would say Genesis 1 has some pretty close ties with the Anuma Alish, right? And so for people that maybe don't know, the Enuma Alish is the text in Akkadian. It comes from the end of the second millennium BCE, and it became the story. It was the story about Marduk who gained ascendancy over the gods. And um, this is a text that it was like the main component, one of the main components of the New Year's festival. It's called the Akitu festival in Babylon, and it was very, very important text for Babylonian religious culture. Um, and of course, it's not really surprising that this text would become, utilized or have influence in the biblical tradition because of, again, this very close immersion that the scribal schools had, these scribal traditions had in their captivity in Babylonia. So I think that's a pretty big one. Um, the Garden of Eden story. Bruce Wells is writing about this right now, Hebrew Bible law specialist down in University of Texas Austin. He's writing a monograph on this. What people have looked. It doesn't seem like there's any particular singular narrative that we can point to say, all right, like the flood story, like what we see in the Anuma Alish. You don't have that sort of, okay, there's the text that it comes from, or like there's the Garden of Eden story. That being said, there are some themes that show up, some kind of specific themes that show up in the Garden of Eden narrative, and some motifs that have led scholars to make some pretty close connections between that story and what we see in some Akkadian texts. So one of the stories that you see talked about quite a bit is the myth of Adapa. And Adapa was this wise sage. He becomes incredibly popular later on with like divination. But he is Enki, one of the main deities. Enki's sort of very loyal subjects, I suppose you could say. And Enki teaches him, or Ea teaches him, these secrets of the gods, essentially about controlling the world and divination and these sorts of things. Um, and in the story, Adapa ends up going to heaven to meet On, or going up to the sky to meet On. And when he does, he's offered food and water of life. And Enki tells him, or Ea tells him, don't drink it, don't eat it, because it's the food and water of death. And so he doesn't, because he's a loyal subject of his god, and he gets tricked, essentially, out of getting eternal life. In the story, you have connection with a snake, or with, a snake-like character named Gishsida. And so there's this sort of missed opportunity at immortality, which is a main theme, of course, in the Garden of Eden story, right? The missed opportunity at eating of the tree of life. You also see this very clearly in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Down at the end in Tablet 11, you have Gilgamesh gets it. He's told where the tree of the plant of life is, of youth, and he decides he's not going to eat it, but he's going to take it back to his city Uruk and feed it to an old man and see if it works, right? And on his way back, he stops to take a bath in a pool of water, and he takes off his clothes and he puts the plant down on his clothes and he goes into the water, and a snake slithers up, eats the plant, sheds its skin as it goes away. And so there's this missed opportunity, right, at immortality. And so these are texts that clearly components of them were utilized to build the Garden of Eden narrative, right? They have had this influence. I use and it's always funny to hear me say it, but I always use Eminem as a parallel here. There's a song that Eminem did, and it's called "Remind Me," and he uses parts of Joan Jett's "I Love Rock and Roll."
Okay.
And
Oh,
in
the
doing,
sample.
yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
And you can, like, if you listen to it, you can kind of like hear bits where he's, you know, playing off of it. He says like, "There goes a dime into the jukebox." And so it's like you can hear these bits where it's clear
Mhm.
he's making this connection, he's making a throwback, but the broad structure of the song is not, you know, near as I can tell, is not similar to what Joan Jett was singing about. But nonetheless,
Mhm.
you know, it is dependent upon Joan Jett. So like it utilizes clearly Joan Jett stuff. It uses components of it to build it, right? To build something new. So that's how I would characterize the Garden of Eden narrative. Um, uh, Obviously, the flood story is a clear parallel. Broad strokes, you know, the form of the story, the way that it works. There's a polemic, I think, pretty clearly involved in the flood story in the Hebrew Bible, but I mean, it's turning it on its head in such a way that it maintains the structure of the Mesopotamian story. So I don't think there's any that's one of those like really clear cut examples.
Mhm.
Um, as far as like people have made note of like Genesis 5 and you know something like the Sumerian king list or you know some of these other you know texts that sort of talk about chronologies and reigns of people, you know, that probably influence there, but again, it's not, I don't know that that would be a major component that I would see.
Mhm.
The Tower of Babel story or the City of Babel story, I think has that's a pretty clear polemic that I don't know that it's utilizing an older myth
Mhm.
as much as it is utilizing an like an ideology, a way that the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians thought,
Mhm.
and turning that way of thinking on its head by utilizing the story. But like the use of the Tower of Babel is probably a very clear, um, um, you know, call to the Atem and Anki ziggurat in Babylon there. But those are sort of like in those in the first 11 chapters, those are the places I think that you see the most clear contact um in individually in its individual components.
Okay. Um, so I kind of want to shift because I'm going to start going through some textual kind of themes that we see in the Hebrew Bible. The next one I want to kind of talk about, and I'm going to kind of go into the Elohim, the divine council idea that you find in Tanakh, and maybe that comes from a Sumerian divine council. Can you describe the Sumerian pantheon, the key players, the Anunnaki, the older gods? I mean, I'm sure you can, I don't want to list them all because I'll let you speak on that. Um, but you know, in Torah, the term Elohim is the plural, Elohai is the singular. Um, and I don't want to get into the document hypothesis yet. So I'll get into a question I have on that. But at the moment, like, um, in which ways may have the Sumerian pantheon influenced the early Elohim divine council idea that we see in the Torah and maybe some of the Talmudic writings, that discussion there?
Yeah. So kind of going back broadly to, you know, the way that ancient Near Eastern people groups and cultures thought, right? That this divine pantheon is something that's common to many, obviously, of the cultures there. So the Sumerian pantheon sort of has at its head, you know, we always talk about like the big three. You have An, who is the sky god. You have Enlil, who is sort of like the in-between space, earth, you know, god. And then you have Ea or Enki in Sumerian, who is the god of like the freshwater springs underground. And those are kind of the big three. You have Ninhursag, who is like a birth deity. These are obviously very complex things. You have tons and tons and tons of gods. Um, and they're not consistent altogether throughout the 3 millennia of Mesopotamian history. So you do have some shifting. You have obviously Marduk takes a much bigger role later on. Asher of Assyria, takes a bigger role in the first millennium when the Neo-Assyrian Empire really takes hold. But by and large, you have these sort of big three at the top. You also have what you were referring to there, the it, some people pronounce it Anunnaki and Anunaki, but these are that comes from a Sumerian term, probably means like of princely seed, but it's still debated what it means. It doesn't mean
Hmm.
what is it that Zacharias, those that came from heaven to earth or something like
My
that. That's not.
understanding was it was On and Ki are in there, and it was the children of On and Ki was kind of my understanding. I don't know, but I mean,
Yeah,
you would be the
so
linguistic expert, so I mean,
it's a Sumerian form. So Ah means seed, Nun means princely, and the Na is attaching an A sound
mhm,
to it, utilizing what's called an Auslaut, copying that N sound from the end of Nun to attach it.
mhm,
And then the Ke on the end is the genitive marker plus E for an agent. That gets picked up in the Akkadian um, as a plural, which is the long I sound. It's probably really boring for everybody, but um, yeah, it. I think the big takeaway from it is it's sort of a group of deities that you see them individually talked about, but when they talk about like the Agigi or the Anuna, these are the two, the Agigi and the Anuna that we see. And in different texts, they go to different places. There are different numbers of them. Again, the tradition isn't unified. Sometimes there's like 300 of them. Sometimes they go to heaven. Sometimes they're set in another world, whatever. But that's sort of how the pantheon is structured. You have An and Enlil and Enki sort of at the top, and with some other female deities like Ninhursag or um, Ninsun is often up there. But then you have these other sort of mainline deities. I'm not sure how you would say that, but slightly lower level. That being said, um, I don't think we want to not downplay, but we don't want to miss the influence that the Uritic Pantheon had um, on the Hebrew Bible and what we see. So the fact that you have Ale present, Ale is very well known deity. He's the chief deity in the Ugaritic pantheon. Again, Jeremiah, I'm sure you know all this, but just for the audience sake, of course, everybody knows Baal or Baal. Throughout the Hebrew Bible, this is the storm deity at Ugarit, and of course, Ugarit is one of the main Canaanite cities that we know a lot about because we have Ugaritic tablets that were found there from the late Bronze Age. Um, and so like we know lots about the mythology up there. We have something called the Baal cycle, but we have other texts that are mythological texts that tell us more about the pantheon up there. We have incantations, we have administrative economics, so the whole gambit. Um, so I think what's happening, and you like you've hit on it even in the question, is the ancient Israelites were Canaanites, right? And so when the Egyptian empire falls, you have these people groups, these cultures that start to sort of spring up and come into their own. So you have the Ammonites that show up, right? And you have Edom, and you have Moab, and you have all these groups that start to kind of come into their own, right? And you end up having the Philistines who have come down with the Sea Peoples. Anyway, um, and I think most scholars would say that Israel is just one of those that sort of comes into its own. And there's probably some contact with Egypt and people that came up out of there, but you know, I digress. Um, but because they're Canaanites, they have Canaanite traditions that they're bringing in. And so if you read passages like Deuteronomy 32 or Psalm 82, or places like I think maybe we'll talk about this later, so I won't say much about it, but like Genesis 1, 26, 27, you see this plurality. And in in these places, I think there's some tension with the writers, with the scribal schools that are putting these
Mm,
texts together and handing them down, because on the one hand, like as you know full well, but they don't want to change the tradition, right? The tradition is that's really important, and of course, as you go later, it becomes even more important. At the same time, they want to make sure that uh, if there's an older tradition that doesn't really work with how they're thinking theologically at the time, that they frame that in a way that, says the message that they want, sends the message that they want to send. And so I think a place like Deuteronomy 32, you can clearly see this distinction, this original distinction between El and Yahweh, right? And yet, I think the writer or the scholar is going to great lengths to try to bring them together into to syncretize them and to say no, they're actually the same. But it betrays is the wrong word, but it sort of shows their hand that they're coming out of a tradition where they were distinct, which is
mm.
unsurprising. And so I think you see hints of that throughout the Hebrew Bible, and even in the use of Elohim in some of these texts.
Yeah, so you kind of touched on it a little bit right there. I want to kind of move into like a conversation about the formation of what we would call the document hypothesis. You mentioned the passage in Genesis, let us make man in our own image. Um, I have a theory. When we look at the four sources, the Elohist, the Yahwist, the priestly, the Deuteronomic, um, that they were written in different time periods. So the oldest source, the Elohist, I think comes very much influenced by the Sumerian tradition. I venture to say that I have a strong suspicion that, we look at the historicity of things past David, it becomes more, it's not as concrete. So the stories in the text, they're more stories of a potential past, but they've been embellished. Um, the point I want to get to with that, though, is that I feel like the transition from the pantheon idea may have been around the time of the pharaoh Akhenaten to the more Yahwehist side. So I think the Canaanite is more the Elohist tradition, like the plurality, the divine council kind of idea plays in there. And I feel like somewhere around that time of Pharaoh Akhenaten is where the idea of the one God, maybe going from polytheism to henotheism to, Yahweh is, now the God, as the tradition comes through, because, and you had talked about the various time periods where they were in captivity and things that this may, the play in the text. I don't know what is your understanding of the document hypothesis, and I take into the culture of, the Sumerian tradition, when they left Egypt, or if there was, the Exodus, I mean, we can talk about Hyksos and other stuff like that, but I don't want to get too deep into that. But just like the document hypothesis and the different, just different cultures that may have influenced
Mhm.
the four different, you know,
Yeah.
what fed the text.
So I always want to say stuff like this at the outset. Like there are obviously specialists in the field that I will but scratch the surface with what I say. So if people are interested in looking in depth at the formation of the Pentateuch and the different theories that are out there, some excellent scholars. Joel Baden is like one of the sort of like the leading experts, Jeffrey Stackert as well on the neo-documentary hypothesis. Conrad Schmidt is a phenomenal scholar. David Carr, Kip Davis just interviewed him on his channel about this specific topic about the formation of the Pentateuch. So there are people that like they spend their careers on this topic. So I just want to say that I don't have a specific expertise in this, so I'll try to keep it at that level. Um, so for everybody that may not know, that's watching or listening, the scholars centuries ago recognized that there are problems with the narrative inconsistencies that we see in the Hebrew Bible. So, like Genesis 1 seems to be a very different account of creation to Genesis 2. The order is different, the language is different, the way that the deity is even described is different. It's just one is very majestic, one is doing trial and error, right? It's something that people noticed again very early on, and so that is what drove this investigation into, is this, because up to that point it's thought Moses wrote this thing, right? Like Moses wrote the whole thing. And so what scholars ended up doing in like the 18th century is they start teasing out, all right, we've got one writer, A, who is putting together like the Genesis 1 story, and here another writer, B, is putting together the Genesis 2-3 story. And then you start to see that they were focusing primarily on Genesis, but they're like going through Genesis and seeing these two different strands, two different threads. Okay, today I like fast forwarding. Today, as you mentioned, the documentary hypothesis holds to three long sources that run through Genesis down into like Numbers, and you know the E source is more fragmentary. Obviously, the P source is very full. Most people agree on the P source, actually, no matter what your view of the formation of the Pentateuch is. Most people agree P and non-P, but so J is supposed to be the one that's like the longest and sort of the most complete. E sort of supplements that, and then P is supposed to be, usually most people say the P is later, and then D is the Deuteronomist, right? So he's primarily in the book of Deuteronomy. Okay. The idea is that either one of those four, some people think P, the priestly writer, is the redactor that brings all those together. Some people think there's a separate redactor that brings those four sources together and sort of, weaves them together as he goes. And that explains why it is that when you read like Genesis 6-9, it looks like you've got two of the command to enter the ark, two of the statement about the flood coming, and two of take each animal, but different kinds. Like it sort of explains that. Okay, so that's one main view of the formation of the Pentateuch. The other big one that has a lot of different views, it's very European, mainly, I don't know about mainly, but certainly this is the dominant European view, is that you don't have four or three long kind of complete stories or sources, traditions that have come down from early on, but instead you have individual blocks of tradition that developed independently. So for example, you have like the Jacob cycle that develops on its own and grows on its own over time. And then you have the Exodus wandering story that develops as its own independent block over time. And it's only at a later time that these get brought together by like a Deuteronomist redactor who uses connections, adds connections to tie them together to bring, how did they get down into Egypt and why did they go down there and become slaves? Like, how did they do that? Right. And then you have theorized, like Erhard Bloom would say, there's a priestly redactor that later on changes that thing that's been brought together as a tradition. And so they think of that more like as a fragmentary supplementary. That's too simplistic, but main blocks of text that are brought together at a later date. Those are the two sort of main theories, and there are variations on all of them.
Mhm.
So both, though, I think um, would be subject to the question of when did these traditions start, right? Where did they come from? How are they influenced? And these are great questions that I don't know that we have good answers to yet. Um, and so if you don't have Israel really developing as a nation unto itself until the Iron Age, and even there's, discussions about how much of what we see in Iron 2, like circumcision or the different dietary restrictions, those sorts of things, how much were they actually in play in Iron 1? Avraham Faust wrote a great book on this about 20 years ago. But like these are all questions about how where these traditions came from and how they got handed down. Okay. I think that a really big component of this, and William Schneidervent just wrote a book on this, who really wrote the Bible, I think is the title. It's a 2024 publication, I think. But I think that a major component of this is you have a Mesopotamian scribal tradition that had been thriving for millennia, at least since the end of the third millennium. And like I wrote my dissertation, half of my dissertation was written on scribal education, and like we know what the curriculum was. Like we can nail it down. Like we have it, right? We know what the curriculum was in these various cities. We know how scribal training was done. And we have evidence of it all the way down into the first millennium because it's copied on clay, which is we still have it, which is awesome.
It'd be nice if some other texts were written in clay, you know?
Right. Put all this stuff to rest, but
Yeah.
but here we are. And so clearly in Babylonia, where the Judeans, were brought into captivity, and scribes from Judah were brought into captivity, and probably some Sumerian people from Samaria that made their way down in exile, or in as refugees down to Judah. Maybe some of them came, but the point is that you have now this interaction where you have in Mesopotamia, which is the religious center. Babylonia is the religious center of Mesopotamia. These old cities, these old Babylonian cities. You have the scribal training happening, and the scribal education utilizes older texts, right? And so because of that, they're copying out things like the laws of Hammurabi. They're copying out things like the Epic of Gilgamesh. Like they're copying out these texts from memory from memory in order to learn to read and to write. Amongst other texts that they have to copy, proverbial statements like long lists of proverbs. We have these. Okay, so if you have scribes, even if they're not being specifically trained, and they may have been, even if these Judean scribes are not specifically being trained as scribes in that Babylonian tradition, and again, they may have, I think there's a good chance that there's a lot of overlap in the community itself, right? And so if you have this old tradition that's being handed down from in its Babylonian circle, that's being maintained in its Babylonian circle to greater or lesser degrees, and you have the Judean scribal guilds, whatever you want to call them, that have their own traditions that they're bringing with them, right? Probably from memory, and they are having this, this scribal culture interaction in Babylon for damn near 70 years. I don't think it's any surprise that we would see things like um, this close connection, for example, in Exodus 21 with the covenant code and the layout of the laws of Hammurabi. Like there's when David Wright wrote his book on this, like the influence of Hammurabi on the covenant code. Like I don't know that I agree with all of his arguments, but I mean, like I think it's very clear there's connections between these texts, right? And um, and I think we're going to talk about this later, but looking at the book of Deuteronomy and how the book of Deuteronomy is structured, uh, um, Jeremy Stackert or Jeffrey Stackert just wrote a book on this in 2023, maybe on Deuteronomy and its influence. And what is the date of Deuteronomy? And I think he pushes it back into like the 8th century, maybe the early 7th. It might be the early 7th century. But um, the point is that it's Neo-Assyrian in its influence, right? And so I don't think any of this context should surprise us, and I don't think that you know uh, looking. Sorry, I'll shut up after this. Like nobody should balk at Isaiah 27:1 being like a loose quote, not that loose, of the Baal cycle, right? Nobody should balk at that. Nobody should balk at what is it, Psalm 68, where he's talking about Yahweh as being the rider on the clouds, right? Which is an epithet of Baal. Nobody should balk at that. And certainly nobody should balk at uh these in the Psalms, in Job, in Isaiah, in Genesis 1, the chaos conf, right? The battle of the sea and fighting chaos, either in a mythologized or demythologized, as we see in Genesis 1 context. Like nobody should be like, oh my gosh, my belief can't be true anymore because it's utilizing older texts. Like that's nonsense.
Yeah.
Eminem is no less creative because he's utilizing Joan Jett, right? In fact,
Yeah.
probably more so
Yeah.
because he's doing it. So yeah. Anyway, I don't know. Probably went off the
Yeah,
rails
no,
there.
no, no, that's a great point. I mean, in the idea of textual criticism, it's not to discredit the beliefs and values, it's to
Right.
understand how it came to be.
That's right.
I believe that, the Torah is, the document for the Jewish people to understand their worldview. We also understand the formation of their nation. The tithe was a taxation to provide for, services, the court. Um, because the temple served as a type of court. Yeah, and I'm not gonna get too off into all that stuff, but I do want to kind of circle back on a couple points. One you kind of touched on, the shared myths, and there's all these myths coming in. We have Mesopotamia, Egypt, and all these different places that play into the development. And you touched on what I was going to ask a question about, but I think I already know where your opinion is on this. But the idea that there was a pre-Diluvian civilization, Graham Hancock puts forth the Younger Dryas hypothesis that I believe it was 12,800 years ago, a meteor caused, a climate crisis that caused, whether or not that happened, there are flood myths around the world. But that's not the big thing. The thing is, there's shared mythologies, and they're trickling down um, into the formation of the Torah. There was one other element in the Torah, textually, that I wanted to find your ideas on the comparison of, and then I kind of have a question on, we know, like, if you're looking at ancient Greco-Roman history, the idea that Romulus was a man, but he was apothesized, he became a god in myth. Caesar was apothesized and became a god in myth. So kind of one of my ideas, and it may share with others, is that these people in the text who are this god, when we're going to the Sumerian myth, the gods did this and that. Maybe it was, maybe is a history of a person who did these things and they was given credit to God. Now I don't know. I'm just wondering where these source of stories came from. But that's kind of like a rabbit trail a little bit. But the part that I'm, in the text that I'm kind of interested about is the connection between, so, they have the Nephilim, which is breeding with the angels and man, like a half god, half man. In the Sumerian tradition, um, the Yajiji, where there was some myth in there where it was like half god, half man kind of thing, or what does that pull from like a Sumerian Akkadian myth somewhere in there?
The difficulty, I think, with nailing some of that down is I think that probably Genesis is going more broadly on a theme than maybe pulling from a particular story. And the theme is uh, separation, right? It's the separation that we see in the Garden of Eden story, where you know the divine realm is to be kept distinct from the human realm. That's one of the big things that you see. And so, of course, this is also something that you see in Mesopotamia. So that like the Adapa myth, the whole point of Adapa, and the same thing with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood survivor Utnapishtim, is like once a human gains knowledge, certain knowledge of the divine realm, like certain knowledge that comes down, there are effects that that can have, and immortality plays into this to the degree that sometimes you have to have that person that has both the immortality and the divine knowledge. You have to have him separated from the rest of humanity, right? Which is why Utnapishtim, the flood survivor, is out at the edge of the world. He's away from everybody because you can't have both of those things and be in amongst humans, right? And of course, from an etiological standpoint, that makes sense. Like, why don't we have people living forever that know all this stuff? Anyway, so I think that probably what's happening in the story of Genesis 6, 1 to 4 with the angels and the human women, um, is it's 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 dealing with this maintenance of the division of the divine and human realm, and it's doing so in a way that, um, again, I don't know that it's pulling directly from a particular myth, certainly not one that I know of, but it's a theme that we see. That demarcation, that distinction, is something that's, I think, pretty well known from certainly Mesopotamian literature and mythology. So I think that's what's going on, or certainly that's being what's picked up on later on in Enoch, the Enochian tradition. Um, and of course, there's interplay there in Enoch with Adapa as well. But we probably don't have, I don't want to go into all of that. But yeah, I think it's probably a little more broad
Mm.
than it is like it's thematic more than it is pulling from a particular myth, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no. And that's good because it's kind of a segue to like kind of final kind of big question here. And the reason I was setting that up is, I wanted to kind of talk about Zachariah Stitchin's work and Dr. Billy Carson's. I'm interested in Assyriology, Sumerian roots of Torah. So when I start hearing things that feel unfounded and disconnected, it causes, it's a playing light and loose with the text. I'm going to give you kind of my rundown of my understanding, and then I want you to just kind of respond from a textual historical, um, because the reason I brought up, were these, like maybe stories of people who existed for
Mm.
Stitchin. It's not gods interplaying and creating things. It's ancient aliens.
Mhm.
Um, um, which is just, I have a hard time coming to that. I mean, maybe there were human beings that existed these stories came off of, but it's so in here. So his interpretation of the Akkadian text, he claims that these gods, um, he interprets them as planets or cosmic bodies. And so the gods of the Anunnaki, he lists 12 of them, are the 12 zodiac signs. He's talking about Tiamat, and there's allegedly somewhere I remember, forget the passage where it talks about like water coming out the belly or something, something to do with waters. Anyways,
Yeah.
he sees it as two planets colliding, and
Mhm.
the water from one goes to the other. That's how we have our moon and like Mars, and like it's whole light and loose with the text. Linguistically, I fundamentally have a problem with his use of the language. It's like, um, how, I guess, what is your critique when you're looking at sources, text, and that of Stitchin, and by extension Billy Carson's use of these myths to tell, it's almost like creating a new religion of sorts, but about these ancient aliens who came from the past. And I think there are echoes of maybe a pre-diluvian civilization or things, and they come in our myths. Yeah, sure. I can't go there with it. I mean, what's your response to that?
Yeah. So, I obviously don't have expertise in like the um that section of the I don't want to say history, but yeah, the past, that far back. That's far before, hundreds of thousands of years ago. That I think, what is it, 435,000 years ago, Sitchin is positing, I think.
Yeah.
So obviously, I don't have any expertise in all the way back there. All I can do is look at his use of, as you say, the textual data. And uh, part of the issue is that it's hard for me to believe that he knew Sumerian.
Mm.
Um, by the way, if anybody's interested, Jeremiah, this is you as well. If you want to learn Sumerian, I teach Sumerian. Each year I run a cycle teaching the Sumerian language. So we're just starting the second semester here. So next time the cycle starts up, if you want to take it, or if anybody out there wants to take Sumerian, you can learn it. We have a
Okay.
book on it. But one of the example that I always give is Sumerian is a complex language in that it's made up of cuneiform signs, right? And cuneiform signs, it's not an alphabet. They can be used different ways. They can be used as syllables. So if I wanted to write the name Joshua, I would write Ja, Ah, Shu, Wa, maybe, right? I'd use 4, 5 signs to do that, and they're different syllables. They're not letters. Um, but they can also be, so they can be used syllabically that way, right? But they can also be used logographically, which means like, the sign ka, the ka sign ka means mouth. So you could just like write the ka sign and that means mouth. But so Sumerian uses both, it uses another type as well. But so the word ga means milk.
Mhm.
The word an means sky or heaven. And then do three, means to build. Okay, so ga means milk, an means sky, do three means to build. In Sumerian, if I wanted to say, if I were a king and I were talking to a deity and I wanted to build that deity a temple, I might say, let me build you a temple. And it would be A2 is temple, Gandu, Gandu. The word is Gandu. Gandu is how they would have said it, right? And Gandu means let me build. The do at the end is do three, and it's the word to build. But Gan in the front, I swear I'm going somewhere with this. Gan in the front is just, it's the part of the word Gandu. It's not made up of ga, milk, and on, sky. It's just they're using those two signs to make the sound gone.
Okay.
Okay. In this type of example, Sitchin would see the verbal form ga on do, written with 3 signs, ga on do, and he would say, "Oh my goodness, look at milk, heaven, build." talking about building the Milky Way.
Oh, okay.
And it's like, okay. I mean, he wasn't, right?
Mm,
That's not what that says. I understand why you're saying that, but it's sort of telling, he's sort of telling on himself, right, that he doesn't know Sumerian because nobody that knows Sumerian would look at that verbal form, that cohortative verbal form, and say, "Oh, that means, you know, milk sky build," right? Nobody would do
mm,
that. Okay, so because of that, I did a review of his book, The 12th Planet,
okay.
years ago now. It's on our channel, Digital Hammurabi.
Okay.
Uh, I think, and I don't remember what it's called, but it's just I've got a PowerPoint where I reviewed a lot of the problems with it. But like he talks about the Mu, right, as this rocket. He calls the Mu the rocket. And it's sort of, you say fast and loose, right? I think it's a really good way of describing it. It's like, here's some iconography. Here's the stele of the victory stele of Naram Sin. Look, Naram Sin is so
Mm,
much bigger than all of his enemies. Naram Sin must have been a giant. It's like,
mm,
well, no, that's not how art worked, right?
mm,
The important person is bigger.
mm, yeah.
You know, just like when a kid draws a picture in counseling, right? They might draw mommy much bigger than daddy because mommy's at home or, mommy's at work and mommy is more important to the child than daddy. And so, or more in charge in the house or something. Anyway, so it's stuff like that it already at its I liken this unto a radar sweep. I used to be in the Air Force and I worked on radios and radar. And when a radar sweeps back and forth, uh, like that's how I view people that talk about a lot of different topics, right? They sweep back and forth. So Christian apologists, for example, they're like radar sweeps. They sweep back and forth talking about everything from philosophy to linguistics to Hebrew to Greek to that. They're talking about everything, right? And the problem is that most of that radar sweep, I don't have expertise in. So like when they talk about philosophy, I don't know. When they talk about evolution, I don't know. But when that radar sweep comes into my area of expertise, they don't know what they're talking about,
Mm,
right? Most of the time. And to me, but they say it with the same confidence. They say it with that same full chest, right?
mm,
And when they do that, it leads me to believe that elsewhere in that radar sweep, they're falling prey to the same problem.
yeah.
And I think that's how I view Sitchin's work. So even though I don't know about 400,000 years ago in human history, what I do know is how he's engaging with the material that I specialize in,
Mm,
and doing so in a way that is quite reckless.
yeah.
And I understand it, um, but it's quite reckless. And so
Yeah.
I suspect that maybe plays into how he deals with other data.
It makes me cringe. I'm like, all right. I'm saying fast and loose because there's all a bunch of things that sound good if you don't dig deeper. And then you
Hmm.
throw all this information together, you create this big story, and it sells books and it's interesting. But yeah, it was kind of I have the this podcast was twofold. It was like I really like the story of Abraham, like where
Hmm.
he came from and what became the Torah. It's so interesting to me. And then the other one is, I keep seeing, Dr. Billy Carson. It's just like I can't. We get into, and I'm just like looking at the Akkadian and all that stuff. Um, I don't want to stay too much on that. I want to finish. My last
Sure.
question that I really want to ask you about is really what linguistic connections are there between Sumerian, Akkadian, and Hebrew, and like as word cognates and kind of like what kind of connections are there?
So obviously, Hebrew and Akkadian are both Semitic languages, and so there's going to be an awful lot of overlap. If you have studied Akkadian or if you've studied Hebrew, it's much easier to learn the other one, right? Because there's an awful lot of overlap there. I suspect it's similar to like if you study French and Spanish. Um, so, that's so there's going to be a lot of overlap there. So like in the discussion about whether Adam or Eve was created from one of Adam's ribs or one of Adam's sides, right? The word Sela there. We don't have any other uses in the Hebrew Bible where Sela means rib. And so, people are like, well, maybe it means side because everywhere that we see it, except for here, it means side. The problem is you can go to the Akkadian, right? And the Akkadian cognate, it very clearly is used in like medical texts to talk about this right here, right? So, and it's talking about the rib, the individual rib. So that's because there's that cognate that makes that sort of interaction useful. Now, where in our context, when we're talking about intertextuality and dependence of one text on another, um, we look for things that stand out as anomalies. The example that I always give in this context is I love Seinfeld, and so there would be nothing for me to say Serenity Now. And if my 12-year-old went to school and said Serenity Now, you could draw some conclusions about that, right? You could say that, I think with very strong confidence, that at its base, if you trace it back, you'll trace it back to Frank Costanza, right? In that episode where they're selling the computers. However, um, you might not be able to make the argument that my daughter knows anything about Seinfeld, right? Because she could have just heard me saying it, and I could have been saying it in a slightly different context than what Frank Costanza was saying it. So you wouldn't be able to take Frank Costanza's meaning of Serenity Now and necessarily apply it to how my daughter was using it. So there's a lot of complexity there, right? But that sort of unique language that's shared between what my daughter said and what Frank Costanza said is pretty clear, right? And the same would be true if she said that guy's Spongeworthy. Spongeworthy is kind of unique, right? We wouldn't be able to say maybe it goes back to like Shakespeare or something. Probably not, right? However, if she went and was telling a story and she said yada yada yada, well, that by itself wouldn't be unique enough. That doesn't make sense. Wouldn't be rare enough of a term to definitively say, well, that must have come from the yada yada episode in Seinfeld, because yada 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 is sort of a phrase that we all use. I mean, not all of us, but it's more common. However, if she said in the same day, Serenity Now, Spongeworthy, and yada yada yada, well, now that yada 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 seems to be leaning, statistically leaning a little bit closer to coming from Seinfeld. So that way of thinking is sort of how scholars come to viewing intertextuality. And so when we see things like in Genesis 1, for example, when we see the word tehom is the deep. And if you look at it in other places, like in the Psalms, it can be personified, right? To the point that like it becomes afraid and it flees from Yahweh, right? And so the deep is this like watery thing. That was really super astute there. Very articulate. But it's something that, because it becomes personified, it's something that stands out. And tehom comes from the same cognate word tamtu, the Semitic tamtu, that Tiamat comes from. Now, I don't think I would be comfortable saying we can show, or we can say with confidence, that Tehom is pulling from the deity Tiamat. I don't know that we can say that. Maybe. But they certainly both go back to this cognate tamtu. And that in conjunction with a number of other things. For example, the fact that Genesis 1 and Genesis, the story in Genesis 2, both start off with a temporal dependent clause is a big deal, right? When God began to create the heavens and the earth is a temporal dependent clause in Genesis 1:1. That's exactly how things like the Enuma Alish or a host actually of other creation stories start off in the Hebrew Bible. They describe, I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, in the ancient Near East, in Mesopotamia, they describe this like it's sort of setting the stage using this temporal clause before the gods began to create. And so it's these sorts of things amidst all the other data that we have making clear, very clear connections in like Genesis 6 through 9, or um, these they all sort of play in together. Just like with my daughter saying Serenity now and Spongeworthy and then saying yada 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 by itself, to home by itself, maybe not. But when you see it in conjunction with all these other things, it lends, greater um, probability to that's making an interplay there. Anyway,
Yeah, okay. Um, yeah, so this has been a really good conversation here. Um, you know, I think it's important, that when I'm very much a skeptic and a critic, I look at text and I want to know what makes it, where'd it come from, what's the earliest
mm,
copies, how many copies are in variation of each other,
yeah.
versus, oh, well, God said it, it's true. And it's like, okay, like, let's figure out what is
Where's the
true
fun in that, you know?
I know, yeah. For me, let's find out what is true, and then from what is true, then let's have a conversation
Yeah,
versus just accepting things at plain face.
yeah.
You know, but yeah, it's a very interesting conversation. It's a topic that I like a lot. Is there any closing remarks you have to kind of bring it all together, the influence of the myth as it kind of comes into the Torah and
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is, and we sort of hinted at it before. I think somebody asked me this today, actually, like, why do I hate the Bible? Or, why am I always trying to debunk the Bible or something? Which is the weirdest question for someone to ask
mm,
me. Because nothing could be further from the truth, right? It's like asking me, why do I hate Akkadian mythology or Sumerian mythology? What are you talking about?
you
I
teach it?
love that stuff,
Yeah.
right? And the creativity that ancient scribal communities had when they're writing these texts is just like mind blowing. And so I guess what I would say is this. My wife is a Christian, right? She's an Anglican. I'm an atheist, but like I don't really care much about that, I guess. Um, the point that I would want to drive home is that nothing that you and I have talked about tonight, nothing that I have said should make anybody say or think, oh my gosh, God can't be real,
Mm,
right? Or, oh my gosh, you know, the Bible can't have like religious or even inspirational value, right?
mm,
Or it can't be inspired by God, like in a particular way. Like nobody should be thinking that
mm,
because it's just not the case, right?
mm,
Now, I I had a very fundamentalist evangelical view of inspiration and inerrancy, and so when I found out that the Philistines, for example, like that doesn't work in Genesis historically, well, now the whole thing just sort of like starts to crumble. Well,
mm,
and nobody should like that should not be an issue.
mm,
If you are not a fundamentalist evangelical and you hold great value with these texts and think that they have divine inspiration, but you don't need it to be like inerrant or inspired in such a way that we should be, anyway, I just don't think that any of the stuff that we're talking about here should necessarily make you say, well, God can't be real. Like none of that is intended to do that.
yeah.
Ancient texts do things, and the things that they do, I leave it open to a God utilizing an ancient text to get his message or her message across in a way that they would like.
Mm,
I just don't think that they're limited in the way maybe that we think they should be.
mm. Um, yeah, I mean, and I come from more of a scholarly tradition, at least when I don't see it as discrediting faith or religion or belief. I just like to know how things are made. I like to know what's in the soup. I believe, in a creator, uh, you know, but I don't necessarily believe that, religions are in sacred text or perfect containers of a factual that, they are historical and cultural and they have a heavy influence. For me, Judaism is very cultural, very something that I do. I like the traditions. I subscribe to intelligent design, that there was a creator and there's a divine being, and I feel like these mystical traditions they pass being a good person, kind of idea, the golden rule to kind of people kind of thing. So, I mean, I don't get into it to like dismantle religion. It's to
Right.
understand the text.
Right.
Like, because I believe in a divine being. I may not subscribe to this way is thus and there is no other way. But I like to grapple with the text, just like it talks about it, in the Torah, wrestling with
Yep.
God. I mean, you've got to wrestle with the text. What is true? What is not?
Yep.
So no, I don't want to, dissuade anybody from what gives their peace and their mind, their soul peace.
Yep.
Um, but yeah, this is just more like to understand like how things are made and
Yep.
make informed decisions off that. I think,
Yep.
we live in a world, we need more facts, we need more debate on what is real and tangible and yeah,
Agreed.
so I just want to say it's been an incredible deep dive with Dr. Bowen. You've given us much insight into ancient, Mesopotamian myth and how it influenced the biblical tradition. Before we wrap up, where can listeners find your work? I think we kind of talked about it a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, if people go to Digital Hammurabi, HAMMURABI.com, Megan has like a mailing list set up. But like all the books that we've written are there, and it links to the different things that were on like our YouTube channel. And of course, if you go to Amazon and type in Joshua Bowen, all my books will pop up. But yeah, I tend to float around on other people's channels doing interviews like this. We just went, Kip Davis, Dr. Kip Davis and I, as a Dead Sea Scrolls guy, we just did a response to Stuart and Cliff Connectley, if you're familiar with those two, on the conversation that they had with Alex O'Connor on slavery and genocide in the Hebrew Bible. And that was on Paulogia's channel. So, we do stuff like that quite a bit. But yeah, any of the courses that, I teach, I'm teaching Hebrew right now. I'm teaching this. I just finished up the third semester, and I'm starting the second semester in a Hebrew readings course. We just read through for Samuel 3, 4 to 10 on, it was last night actually. So, yeah, just staying busy, but that's all on the website. You can find information for all that there.
All right, fantastic. And for all you listening, make sure you subscribe to the Pulling Threads podcast for more deep exploration of history and mythology. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, keep pulling the threads to unravel the deeper story and uncover the truth found in ancient historical research.